Hi, and welcome back to I Should Have Raised Dogs, the story of my mother, my father, and America in the 20th century. So this narrative is going to be told a little out of order, go back to front, I'll hop back and forth, and because that's life. And in this case, the thing I want to really talk about is William. William was my mother's brother. Now, this would have been the other son from my grandfather, Jacob Zeev, and Pearl Zeev, who then became Pearl Grover, who's my mother's mother. So my mother was born in 1934, and it seemed to have been an arranged marriage, going back over some of this. Jacob Zeev was much older than Pearl, and the whole idea of people being... there being Jewish background in my family was something that was very hidden. I mean, if you notice, the last name is Christensen. I mean, my dad was a charming guy, I'm sure. And yet I'm pretty sure Christensen was somewhere in the consideration when my mother was looking to generally hide her Judaism. She wasn't raised Jewish that I know about. My grandmother got a divorce from my grandfather. The divorce was finally officially granted in 1947. Which looks like clearly a decade after both Jacob and Pearl are actually separated. And in the meanwhile, Pearl has also had several children, my step aunts and step uncles, with Edward A. Grover, who then becomes my mother's stepfather. One of the turning points in my mother kind of opening up about talking about her family history was when I found out some real evidence about her brother. Now, she couldn't have remembered the things that she said she knew. My mother was 3 years old. She claimed that she had been in an orphanage. There's evidence of this. She claimed that her father left. Evidence of this. She claimed that the nurses neglected him, and she still blamed my grandfather for this, in that, if he were there, maybe William wouldn't have died. It never really made any sense, but the idea of there being an uncle or someone who was related to my mother, or there's just something. I wish I could tell you even what drove me, but something about it seemed weird. So I found myself in a cemetery in Queens, the Linden Hill Jewish Cemetery, right by Ridgewood, where my mother was living. He went down to King's Hospital he was pronounced dead at King's Hospital. It was closer around Brooklyn, Queens, and Long Island. There's this mental separation between, oh yeah, that's Brooklyn, and oh yeah, that's Queens, but it's actually not that far to drive. At that time, it was probably 20 minutes. But William was less than 3 months old. And when the cause of death was there, it said of congenital heart disease. And the person who was there to receive him was Jacob Zeev. One other small detail about this was that I found out that Jacob was living in an address in Brooklyn. It's possible that if my grandmother was in a mental institution, which was ultimately the cause for, or the grounds for their divorce 10 years later, and William died, it's remotely possible that Jacob Zeev and his family, because he had family in the city as well, brothers and sister-in-laws, that they chose to just abandon my mother and put her into an orphanage. It seems really unlikely to me, but unlikely things happen. No matter what, Pearl was not in a state to handle it. There was no one else to support her. The few things I see is that when Pearl was committed, she seems to have been living separate from Jacob. I have Jacob showing up in around 73rd Street in Brooklyn, and I have Pearl living up in Williamsburg in Brooklyn, which are kind of at opposite ends of the borough. To stand in a Jewish cemetery And to find the actual records of where he was, William was just buried in kind of a common grave. It was very standard, unfortunately. This type of death at that time was quite typical from everything that I understand. My mother had never wanted us to be seen as Jewish. I was not raised Jewish. I don't really know much from Judaism, to be very honest. But that is our background and that's our heritage, and it's been a big process of learning it. So when I presented all this information to my mother at 70, I wasn't, by the way, I wasn't saying like, hey mom, we're Jews, I can see it, I proved it. It was actually about her brother. It was actually about, hey, you've been blaming everybody. You've been blaming yourself. Because my mother, into her 70s, would cry at the mere mention of her brother's name. Someone who she had lost, someone who was just, through a series of just tragic things that all happened in the same space and time in my mother's early life, no doubt triggering trauma, but that she couldn't have really been of the age to remember it so clearly. William was born on February 2nd, 1937, and died on May 5th, 1937. And in the middle of all that time, also, Sally Lifshitz, who was my great-grandmother, died through sort of lengthy, protracted problems with surgery and diabetes. She had a fear of needles and could never really deal with insulin or anything. And my understanding was that she had her leg removed and then had a gangrenous reaction, and she died within about 10 days in the space of William's short life. My mother loses a grandmother, loses a brother, loses a father, and loses her mother, basically. Or for a period of time, she has no idea where in the world that she is. And I've long chose to say that this is kind of the source of a lot of my mother's separation anxiety and all that. But it's probably the source of a lot of different things. And these are things that she carried with her from the time that she was 3 years old until that she was, in her 70s. As I recall it, when she was about 73, so 70 years of her life. This was the story, and this is what had defined her considerations of the world and the way that she saw herself. And something did shift after that with her. I felt honestly strange showing my mother the death certificate for her brother. But it felt really necessary. Like, here's information about the story you've been telling. Here's something that tells some facts of this part of your life. And this little thing, and going through the family history, I don't know if I'm trying to find some truth so much as I am trying to tell a story that's maybe a little bit more complete. But there's no photos of William. I think maybe there's one. I'm not even sure if it's him. But he was this invisible child who would have been my uncle, who would have potentially been a connection for an entirely different family and an entirely different world that beyond what my mother had wound up in. And I think on a level, the idea of her having a brother would have changed something in her life. Maybe she would have still been in the Zeev family. Maybe she still would have had her father with her. Maybe. It didn't happen. But I think somewhere in my mother's mind, there was always that idea that it would have been happier for her if it had happened differently. And this was one of those stories. And at the very least, she would have had a brother. I think that her being a stepchild in that family was an issue for her. And it was something that bothered her, as it was for her being Jewish. And these were all things that she would have buried when she was, in her 70, 73, thereabouts. And she saw that. I did see her face shift. And it was a good piece of information for her to have. And after that, my mother started kind of talking a lot more about her life and this time. And it changed. It didn't have the same kind of regret. Not about that. But she carried that with her for her entire life. And that was just true for her. And every time she told herself and every time she went back over it, it became more and more true and more factual. And it wasn't. And I personally don't always feel like the truth is the best thing in both cases. I love a good lie. I think that there's many times that a good lie is really sometimes better than a shitty truth. And for my mother, this was just a more incomplete version of her own life. This was something that was missing. And maybe that piece, maybe that knowing brought a little something back. Maybe even just knowing where her brother died and where her brother went to. There's so little information in these forums and these things that we see about the end of a life. All William has to show that he ever existed are a handful of pieces of paperwork. A birth certificate and a death certificate. And between them, you probably don't have 100 words written about the child. And that's all that ever existed about him. And yet, in my mother's mind, William's death was the cause of every problem that she'd had. And everything splintered off from that. And I don't know if it was a story that she always told for her whole life, but it was one that she was telling a lot as she got older. So there's some value to all this. And there's some interesting value to knowing the truth of a thing. And I hope it made a difference for my mother. But without that kind of shift, I don't think I'd be able to tell any of this history, really. Hi, I keep forgetting to put these things in, but please hit subscribe if you want, if you want to find out about the next episode, and hit the little bell so you get notifications. And of course, make comments. I would love to hear if these stories resonate for anybody. If you have any curiosities about this, I may not tell you, but I'm definitely going to look into it. Thanks so much for watching, and see you soon.